We've got two new units to talk about this week with Ellshra, our MR light unit on the left, and Rhaldor, the fire UR unit on the right. So yeah, I guess his name isn't Lardu, that's what we were expecting it, but we saw the translation in the War of the Visions calc.com data mine, so Rhaldor it is, and both these units are actually pretty intriguing in their kits. It's going to be a very interesting should you pull. Thank you to warofthevisionscalc.com for all the information used in this video. And now let's talk about Ellshra. She is a MR light unit, main job, time mage, but she gets Rune Knight, which is our first appearance of this as a sub job, as well as white mage. So she has a ton of applications already, and then we're gonna find out in a second that her stats really do stack up for an MR unit. So while her HP, that's low, she has good AP, and she has very, very high magic. Like, this is ridiculous, 375 magic, and this is kind of the trend that we've seen with Rune Knights, that Rune Knights always get high magic. Dexterity is just awful, and luck is below average. Agility, it's pretty good agility for an MR unit, and then no added defense or spirit. So right off the bat, we're looking at a pretty nice kit, and if you're worried about accuracy, well, her master ability, let's talk about it. Her master ability gives the light anthem that will power up your light units, their HP by 10%, their light attack by 10%, and it will increase 20% magic for herself and 15 accuracy for herself. So that 375 that I'm showing you right now, that includes the master ability magic and the board node of magic as well. That's part of why it's so high, and that just means also that her base magic is high for it to get up that to that number. So very, very good so far, and I love that we have this easy access to that light boost for your other units, and you can put that on an MR unit, and time mage is always going to keep a unit relevant. So looking at her resistances, she's weak to dark, of course, and she's also weak to slow, but then she's strong against stop, which is always relevant, silence, which is super important, and disable. So those are all really good resistances. Her damage type resistances aren't so good. There's really nothing to talk about here. She has low HP anyway. She's not meant to take any hits at all. She's meant to be protected via a tank or a couple of tanks. Her TMR is a rod, and it's okay. I mean, increased JP is fine for like the farming side of things. It's not a TMR that you're going to put on a unit for any sort of, high level content. Although the evade is kind of interesting. I don't really understand the application of that yet, but if we get a very evading mage, then you might want to use this. But then again, with stat stacking, is this ever going to be a relevant amount? It's kind of just random, but TMR is a TMR. And then for her passives, this is going to be something that we'll have to think a lot about, and I'm actually going to go into bigger or greater detail in the next slide about it. But she gets that CT null, which is really important if she's a time mage. But then she gets both the Rune Knight passive, so the increased light attack and the spirit penetration and the accuracy. So she can stack even more accuracy. She can get up to 35 without even putting on a piece of equipment, and that's actually pretty relevant. So and then of course the speed cast with a decreased deactivation time is really important for time mage as well. So it's going to be hard to pick her passives, but they're pretty much all good except for the Nullified Doom. I mean, what the hell? Okay, counters. I just like using the slow counter, so putting slow on an opponent is really good. I don't think that AP is going to be a massive deal for her with the Rune Knight passive. And then the same thing with giving herself regen. I don't think she's going to survive many hits anyway. So if she survives a hit, that's already great. I'd rather just her put slow on the enemy. Now, if you do decide to build Ellshra, she's a unit that you're going to want to use each of her sub jobs, and that means that you're going to need to think about different loadouts for each of those jobs. So we're going to take a look at each of them, and I'll mention the skills that I think are important and why. So first of all, we have the Time Mage, and I'm thinking about if you use Time Mage on auto, then she's going to be able to use Haste and Slow because that's on her sub Time Mage kit, and you'll want to have that CT null to nullify Haste, Slow, Stop, Quicken for herself. And that's really important that she doesn't cast Haste on herself, because if she does, she can stay back and not move up with your team, and then that means that she might not be in range to do anything relevant with her other abilities. And then the decreased activation activation time, that's just always good. You want your spells to go off quickly so they can affect your units or your opponent's units as fast as possible. The same thing with the Rune Knight, the decreased activation time is always going to be important, and that's because you will still have spells to cast. You're still going to have Quicken on any single sub that you use because it's on her main job, and you're also going to have things like Meteor and Comet. And then you have two choices. You could go Light Attack up 25, and that's going to affect all of her Rune Knight abilities, but it's not going to actually affect her different Time Mage spells because Meteor and Comet, they are non-elemental type of damage. So in that case, you might think, well, I'll use Spirit Penetration and the accuracy, and I think for the accuracy, it's definitely worth it, but for the Spirit Penetration, that's really good for things like Tower, for PvE content, but it's not always as relevant for PvE or PvP, although sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. It depends on which units you're picking. If you're going after Engelbert teams, then you're not really worried about getting that Spirit Penetration, but if you're going after like a Rain, then yeah, I guess you would want to have that on there, but not a lot of units have super high spirit anyway, so it's not always important to have Spirit Penetration. I learned that watching a Cabbage video. Now for White Mage, definitely you again want the activation time decrease because you're going to be casting big heals, and we'll talk about which heals in just a little bit. And then I would actually put that in the Spirit Penetration and the accuracy, and again the reason is she doesn't have any light attacks, she doesn't have Holy. You're going to want to have this accuracy just for the sake of it. It's going to do you more good than light attack, and then you don't get that decrease in dark resistance either. Now we'll take a look at her kit, and this is the most important thing, the main skills on a Time Mage job. You're always going to have Quicken, she's got Stop, she has Immobilize, and she has Comet and Meteor, so those are all fine, but the Quicken is the most important thing. It means that she can be a DPS Rune Knight with Quicken, she can be a healing White Mage with Quicken, but she also still gets that Meteor, and that Meteor has a pretty sizable potency, 220% damage. That's actually pretty huge considering that she has 375 magic, so she can do a lot of damage and non-elemental type of damage. I think that's actually sneaky relevant on this unit and something that we have to pay attention to. The sub skills for Time Mage are actually something that I don't think you're going to use that often. I mean, if there's a team that getting haste off on your units is incredibly important, then yeah, I think you might use this. In live PvP, if haste is really important, then again, you might use this sub. But where I actually think that you might use her is as a Rune Knight, because again, she has crazy high magic and she gets some really cool skills here. So the two buffs that she can get here, one of them is Drain Evocation. It's not a strong skill, but it is her longest range skill with 5 panels that it can move across, and it doubles her magic for 1 turn and gives slash resist penetration for 1 turn. And then really the only slash move that she's actually going to use though is the Hazard Slash, and that's at the very bottom there. It's a huge potency and it takes away some of her health, which doesn't really matter because she's dying anyway, and will need to get pretty close to use it, and that's why I don't think the Banished Blade there is relevant at all, because you don't really want her right next to your opponent's unit. But even if she uses the Drain Evocation, she could then cast a Meteor or a Comet and do even more damage. And the same thing goes for Hazard Spells, which consumes your HP and gives you a 50% magic buff for 3 turns. And she also has a Light Imperil, which I don't think she'll use on auto, but could be very relevant for raids, PvE, or possibly even live PvP, although again, she's got so many other things that you're casting, I don't think you're going to be wasting your time with that. And then finally, White Mage, this one is mixed. So she gets all of the heals. She gets the Curaga, Curata, she gets Protect and Shell, the Cure and Cura, all that type of stuff. She has Asuna, but she does not get Full Life and she does not get Holy, and that's kind of a shame. That would probably put her over the top. I think if she had one or either of those skills, you'd actually have to really consider pulling for her because she just has so much on her kit. But basically, you're gonna have to make a choice of, do you want a healing unit in your party that doesn't have something like Ayaka's LB and no Full Life, but you get access to Quicken and you get access to Meteor and Comet? Or do you want to have that ability to use Quicken and DPS with the Rune Knight? Or do you want someone hasting your units? She has so many different roles that she can fill, and I think that's really something that we don't want to underrate. Okay, so for some unit comparisons, I'm going to use a couple of different comparisons. We're going to talk about Phoebe and Chell because they're both SR and MR units stats, and they both fulfill that time mage role. Now, something to consider here is that neither of them have high magic, so they're not meant to be damage dealers, they're meant to be support units. Phoebe at this point really is hard to justify because of her low agility, her low HP, or basically her low stats across the board. But the thing that Phoebe has that other units won't have is the full life, and that's really important sometimes to have that full life. And the base drop quicken, of course, is always really important. That means you can have the white mage sub and then still use full life. Now for Chell, she gets a lot in her toolkit, but she doesn't get Meteor, but she does have Imperil. So the lack of Meteor isn't, again, a huge deal because Chell does not have a high magic value. You'd rather her use Imperil, which has a pretty low potency, but then will Imperil 25% to all elements, and that's going to make the rest of your party do more damage. But again, Chell isn't really meant to be doing damage. She's going to be hasting, quickening, doing all sorts of buffs or debuffs to your opponents, and that's something that Ellshra can do as well. And if we want to look at like a more comparable unit in terms of damage, well, we've got Helena, and we just got a boost for her with the VC, so I mean, maybe we're going to see more of her. She also has insanely high magic. She gets a lot of magic from her master ability and from her board, but the thing is, she doesn't have Meteor either. She does have Imperil, and she has the exact same white mage kit as Ellshra, but if you want to use Quicken with Helena, you have to equip the time mage sub, and then you're not going to be having the same access to the DPS capabilities that Ellshra is going to have, but you will have the same white mage capabilities that Ellshra has. But beyond all of this, Ellshra is always going to have Meteor and Comet, and that's a really big deal. So at this point, Ellshra, like, she's going to blow away some of these MR units with the different things that she can do. Well, let's compare her to a UR unit. So you can see she actually has more magic than Skahal does, but Skahal does have two passives to increase his magic by 30%. He has a super high potency ability in Flare. He also has a limit break. He's got better stats all around otherwise. So he is like obviously still a better unit than Ellshra, but just to compare to a UR, she's not that far off, and certainly her utility is worth including in a lot of different parties. So I'm going to try to be as objective as possible for this review, but I am really excited for Rhaldor. I'm going to be pulling for him for sure, and I'm actually setting myself up for a bit of disappointment here if I don't get him, because I have not really anticipated a unit like I have with him, and that's kind of a personal thing that I'm going for with the fire team, but I'm going to talk about him and then see if you want to pull for him too. So he is a fire unit. He has 3 move and 2 jump, so already look at that, an extra jump, wow. And he has a main job pugilist, which is new to us. It's got a lot of cool stuff that we'll talk about. He also has paladin and thief sub jobs, which is certainly very interesting, although he's a paladin, but he has to wear hat, cloth, and accessory, and that's something that you have to keep in mind. His stats are really good all around, except the one thing I'm going to note on is his attack. Now his attack, it's not bad by any means at all, but it's not as high as some of the like top DPS units in this game, and that includes using passives to get up higher. So he's not going to be this top tier attacker, and we'll talk about more about why that is in a little bit. But he is going to have just incredible stats all around. His HP is high, not as high as like a tank's, but it's very high. He's got very high dexterity and luck. He has decent agility. He gets 12 defense, which is pretty good. And then his master ability, it gives the anthem for the fire units, the 10% fire HP or the 15 fire attack. But then he gets 20 defense penetration, and that's really nice to just innately always have that no matter what. He gets 20% more attack from his board, which is really important, but he's still not going to be like, that's this 354, that includes the 20%. So he's still not going to be getting way up there. Now for his resistances, we've got that strength against ice and weak against water, and something to consider is we will see lots of water in the future because Tidus is a free unit, he's a water unit, and if I said his name wrong, you can just get out of here. Confuse, stop, and disable resistance, those are all really important. That's like your Agrius resist pack right there, which is pretty awesome because how difficult Agrius is to deal with. And then his resistances are pretty good too. So slash resist, good to have in positive. Pierce resist, very good. Projectile resistance, very good. Punchin', I mean, who punches? I guess Rhaldor does and Cecil does, but. And then 15% magic weakness, and that's fine. I mean, that's, you got to sacrifice it somewhere. His TMR is pretty good. It's got some HP, some attack, accuracy, and defense. Those are all 4 nice stats. And then it has an ability to increase your accuracy by 30 for 3 turns and move by 1 for 3 turns. That is a lot of utility, and it's an accessory, so you can give this to, I think, pretty much anybody. So that's going to be actually a pretty big reason to max him, to get that TMR, because that's going to open up a lot of possibilities for a ton of units to get that extra move. The accuracy is always welcome, both on the ability and on the stats, and then just attack and defense, that's great. So I see this as a huge plus to maxing him, and definitely something that you want to look into. Let's take a look at his passives next, and there's a few interesting ones to consider. So Flurry Enhancement is a skill that upgrades his Flurry counter, his Pugilist counter ability, and increases your accuracy by 20%. Holy Knight's Protection is your defense buff, and then Warrior Spirit is even more HP and attack buff. This is his only attack buff, and you have to use this if you're going to use him as a DPS. Thief Lore gives him agility and move, and then acquired AP up is just acquired AP up. Those are all good skills. Every single one of these has a case to be made for why you should include it. I'm gonna have a really hard time picking what I want to use with him, but the most important thing is you remember, what is his single purpose in your party? Is it going to be as a tank? Well, then you just have to use the Holy Knight's Protection, and you likely will want to use Warrior Spirit or Thief's Lore, because you might not be using his counter as a tank. You might be using Sword Guard or Paladin's Guard, whatever it's called. And then if you're going to use him as a DPS, well, Warrior Spirit's going to be very relevant, and then acquired AP up might be something that you want to try out. Or if you're going against Evade, then Flurry Enhancement will be a really big deal. I think Thief's Lore is going to often be a fine choice anyway, because agility and move are always good, especially on a tank. So definitely we're going to have to do some testing around that. So Flurry counter is that ability that gets upgraded, and it becomes a very strong counter if you get that Flurry Enhancement sub on. And then it's also 2-hit, which is kind of interesting. That is relevant for, not necessarily for chaining, you're not going to bank on countering, but it is actually important if you're, let's say you're duking it out with an Agrius, you're using Rhaldor as a tank, and he uses Taunting Blade on her, and she has her wall up. So she has damage reduction 3 times. She runs up and she smacks Rhaldor, and he Flurry counters. All of a sudden, that's dispelled her barrier. It's 3 hits from the Taunting Blade and the 2 from the counter. That could actually be kind of relevant. Same thing with like Cecil's ability. If someone has Cecil's barrier on and then he counters against them, you know, you could strip barriers pretty quickly. So definitely something to consider. Okay, so Pugilist skills. What does he get on the main job? He gets Resetsu Strike, which is a move to target panel, and this is why you might not need to have that move +1, because he can move up with this skill if you want him to get up front and center and then tank. Iron Body Stance is a defensive buff, which is pretty good. 15 defense for 3 turns, and then increase max HP and restore HP raised, or sorry, restore the HP that you're going to get. Increase the HP that you will have restored for 3 turns as well. So this is a really good buff and something you definitely want him to use if he's going to be tanking. Shura's Pummel is going to give him Human Killer, and it's got an okay potency. It's also an AoE, so that's something to consider. It's like a break skill where it hits the 3 panels in front of you. Demon Purger is a very strong skill, and this one I'm still trying to figure out. So if you receive damage 5 times, then it's going to increase the modifier. That's going to be kind of hard to do. I'm not really going to count on that at all. And then Pugilistic Mastery, increase strike attack 40 for 3 turns for allies. So if you use this on King Elda, then he's going to get 40 strike attack for his monk sub, or Cecil is going to get 40 strike attack for his monk sub. And then increase your own defense penetration by 20. This is really important for him being a DPS, because his attack isn't super high compared to some other units, and because he actually doesn't get any strike attack on any of his passives like other monks would, then you definitely need that strike attack as well. If he doesn't use this ability, he's really going to be a lot weaker than you need him to be for DPS. And then on the sub, he gets breathing technique, which will restore his HP, but you probably want that on him if he was a tank, and he can't tank if he has this sub. And then Spirit Breaker is another interesting skill that will debuff your opponent's attack by an actual pretty serious amount. This is something to consider. I would definitely want to look into this for PvE as well, and something like live PvP, and test around with that. And one other thing with the breathing technique, he's not going to use this very often at all in auto content, except he might use this on the second guild battle to heal himself up before he goes in to fight again. And now let's take a look at his sub jobs. Paladin is pretty straightforward. The most important thing here is that he has Sentinel, Taunting Blade, and Saintly Wall. He does not have Immortal Spirit, unfortunately, but that Saintly Wall is a really big deal. So 50% damage mitigation for 3 times for physical damage mitigation. That's a really big deal, and that's something that Agrius has used to quite good effect. That's going to allow him to be used in a similar role to her in live PvP and PvP, being kind of a tank, but also being kind of a bruiser that can march forward with mitigation and buffs, and be able to survive long enough to attack back. He's not going to have the status effects that she has, but he is going to have a different type of damage and a higher type of damage than she will. Thief is just going to give you your typical Thief stuff, and you're really going to use this for a couple of reasons. One, steal time for any sort of PvE content that needs that, and then for sneak attack, because it has a guaranteed critical hit when attacking from behind, and that's actually a 100% hit as well, so that can be pretty relevant. So definitely a reason to use it, but I think you're mainly going to be using Paladin or his main job sub. His limit burst is called Chasm Render, which is the coolest name pretty much ever, and it does 200% damage. That's not insanely high, but it's high. It's a high potency. 43 AP cost is high, and then it decreases the strike resistance for 38% for 3 turns if you've upgraded the LB. This is our first strike in peril, so it automatically has relevance because of that. You might use this in a full striking party with other strikers like Elda and Mont, or somebody like Ziza. You might use this in PvE content as well if someone's weak to strike, and then you further weaken them. But in the end, I don't think this is the most relevant limit burst because there's just so few strikers out there. There will be more strikers in the future. This LB can only get better with time. So I'm going to make more comparisons than usual for Rhaldor because he fills multiple roles and there's multiple ways to take a look at him. So the first thing we'll compare him to is going to be other striking units, and I've chosen Ziza as one because she's just a pure striker like he is, and then Cecil, who I've been using a lot as a striker with his monk sub. And you can see that Rhaldor generally has better stats than these other 2 units. He's got better agility, his attack is higher, although Cecil does have self-sacrifice and will actually get higher attack than Rhaldor does. But something that Ziza and Cecil have that Rhaldor doesn't is that they can passively have strike attack plus. So Ziza gets 20 strike attack if you use her passive plus her master ability, and then Cecil can equip the 15 strike attack passive and just have that on without having to apply a buff. Plus you can have self-sacrifice to do a lot of damage, and that's going to actually mean that Cecil can maybe do more striking damage than Rhaldor, unless of course Rhaldor gets his strike attack buff off. Now, the other thing we can compare him to are bruisers. So first I'm going to compare him to Thancred, and you can see that Thancred's got way better HP, and he has better attack, but he has no way to raise that attack, remember. But then Rhaldor, he gets that agility really can't be underrated compared to other units that are similar to him. That 12 defense, that 191 dexterity, plus he still has luck over 200. Those are all really good. And then Dwayne is another kind of a tank, kind of not a tank, bruiser type unit, and that's another good comparison for us. Now, Rhaldor is not going to compare to Dwayne at all with DPS. That's just not the way that we're going to compare him. But if you take a look at all the rest of his stats, he does match up pretty favorably in terms of his defense, in terms of agility, the luck and the dexterity. He's matching these units or doing better than them in those areas. So he's definitely set up to be a bruiser. Now, Rhaldor can be used as an actual tank, and the reason is he can generate hate, he can use Taunting Blade, whereas those other units couldn't, so we should compare him to other tanks as well. So we're also going to use his resistances as a comparison. So first up is Engelbert, and Engelbert, he's just got crazy defense, he's got some of the best resistances around, he's got more HP than Rhaldor does, but then he has a huge drop off in attack. While he's a little bit more evenly spread, he has some magic resistance and he has less defense. He actually has the same, defense that Rhaldor has there, but again, he's a lot weaker in his abilities, and he has, lower dexterity than Rhaldor has. And when you take a look at it this way, you can definitely make a case for Rhaldor being a tank, especially for piercing abilities and for projectile abilities. And that magic resistance, it's gonna suck when you come up against mixed teams, but he could definitely be used as a main tank in my opinion, because he has the important buffs that you need, and he has the hate generation, and you can see that his HP is a little bit lower, although he does get passives to raise that, but he has the defense, and the nice part is that if you do use him as a tank, he's not going to be as much of a wall as Engelbert, but he's going to do more damage. He's actually going to contribute a little bit more on offense, and I think that's definitely something that I like to see in a tank. Time for some pros and cons. With Ellshra, she's definitely pretty good. I mean, she has a high magic stat and she can do UR level damage. She can support your light team, and she has utility for live PvE, PvP, PvE content, and she's not going to be as strong in auto content, but I think she will still be pretty strong. For cons, I mean, low HP, dex and luck, bad resistances, and no full life or holy, but I'm actually considering building her. If I go for Rhaldor and I don't get him and I got her, then I might actually consider building her, and the only thing holding me back is the fact that I already have Howlet, but even then I still might consider it because I do love my light units. Then for Rhaldor, he's got a lot going for him. He has great all-round stats except for attack. He has versatile sub-jobs, defense penetration, good resistances, human killer on his main kit, which can again help him deal more damage. And then strike attack is really hard to protect against. There's not a lot of strike attack resistance up in this game. For cons, he's not the strongest attacker, but he's not weak. Like, I'm trying to temper expectations in that he's not a Super Stern, a Dwayne, he's not a Kane, he's not going to be doing these huge amounts of damage, but he's not a weak attacker at all. He is a bruiser. He's also a pretty short range attacker, which is something to consider. The only skill that has big range is Taunting Blade, and then you're going to use him as a tank. So if you want to use him as a DPS or as a bruiser, but not as a tank, then you have to consider that as well. And something I did not include here that I did mention is that he can't equip armor. So if you are looking to use him as that, all-around tank, then the amount of armor that you can't actually use with this guy, that's actually quite relevant. That's important, that you can't use your, Final Fantasy 14 UR helm. You can't use your golden armor with him, and that is going to give you less options for resistances for tanking. In the end, the question is, should you pull? And I think for Ellshra, well, I don't think I can honestly recommend pulling for an MR with the 1-year anniversary and EX jobs coming up, but if you ever pull her by accident at any point in the game, I think that it's a really solid choice to build her. I think she's a long build, and I think that you won't be disappointed with her. As for Rhaldor, well, of course I'm going to recommend him. You have to pull for him. He's awesome. He has so many different roles that he can fulfill. He is a strike attacker, and that's going to be relevant into the future, even with EX jobs. I definitely think that he's a unit worth going for, and I'm not biased at all. But in the end, it's going to be up to you to make your own decision. So let me know what that decision is. Are you going to pull for these guys, or are you going to just wait for the 1-year anniversary, as I know that many of you are? So we'll get to chatting in the comments, and I'll see you all next time.